there are three major options for building plugins. There's a Teams message extensions that you can actually create. There are Power Platform connectors and OpenAI plugins. Let's dive now into the extensibility options. And there's a few of these. Microsoft's a platform company. They're working their hardest to build not just a product suite, but a platform where you can build experiences on top of Copilot. And of course, there's a low code as well as a pro code direction here. So for those that are low code, we're going to go into Copilot Studio. For those that are pro code, you're welcome to stay after the webinar. We can absolutely dive into some of the code as well. But we're going to focus primarily on the low code today. And those tools, both Visual Studio Code as well as Copilot Studio, are some of the best in class compared to some of the other products that are available out there. Building plugins. Now, for extending and building those plugins, the key to remember is what you're building is skills within your organization for your employees. So that's the important part, and we can dive into scenarios there as well. But there are three major options for building plugins. There's a Teams message extensions that you can actually create. There are Power Platform connectors and OpenAI plugins. For any organization that is looking at experimenting with Copilot plugins and are unsure, or as a developer, you're unsure of how and where, which direction to go. If you haven't already, one of the recommendations we'd have is for the short term, invest quite a bit into the Teams message extensions. There's very quick ways to kind of adapt and adjust the Teams messages to make them Copilot enabled. And you're going to see this in the coming weeks as well as Microsoft Build makes some major announcements. You're going to see a lot of investments into some of the Power Platform connectors, as well as the work that they're doing with OpenAI plugins. All right, so for the Teams message extensions, if you're familiar with how they're built and how they're designed, you know the kind of the core building blocks are essentially an app backend. This is your app logic that contains the Teams bot message extension, as well as API-based message extension. So that app backend will continue to interact with your applications and call the APIs. And then there's the manifest. The manifest is essentially a menu to let Teams know, as well as Copilot know, to describe what the app does. So the manifest, and then on top of that, the user experience, which is the adaptive card, just a platform agnostic snippet that's available. It's very easy to edit. There's even some web-based art applications that are available that allow you to create your own adaptive cards. But that's the front-end user experience for plugins. So those are the kind of the three core main things for extensions. Now let's shift over to what are the values of plugins specifically for when you're building a plugin versus a graph connector. First and foremost, plugins allow you to connect your Copilot to third-party applications. They allow you to retrieve real-time business data because you're making direct API calls. And then you also have the ability to assist users with actions through these customized, kind of very customizable adaptive cards. Users can actually take actions directly on those adaptive cards. And then, of course, since you've already been developing and leveraging some of the plugins available, you're now able to take advantage of the existing investments already that you've made in the Microsoft ecosystem or build your own. For the Microsoft Graph connectors, there's three major components here. There's the actual connection. This is creating the Graph API that is going to actually create a connection and register the connection settings. There's a schema, which is identifying this application that we're connecting to or this data set that we're connecting to, defining what that data structure looks like. It's a JSON file that includes the metadata, the properties, the labels, the semantic labels that you need, as well as the aliases. And then there's the index items. This is once the data has actually been ingested. It's the external items and activities and index of it. And generally, you apply appropriate control for users and groups in terms of the amount of access or the type of access they're going to have. In terms of the value of graph connectors, the important part here is that what I highlight is accessing the enterprise knowledge from your data sources, because not all the data is going to be Microsoft 365. So if you have other data warehouses applications that you're leveraging, graph connectors are a great way to ingest that data into your Microsoft 365 corpus. It becomes a part of the semantic index, which essentially allows the graph to index your content, and it becomes part of the graph, and immediately it's accessible by Microsoft 365 for content like documents and emails. It's a really effective way to kind of bring in that data so that there's a centralized place to query that data. You also have the ability to discover content across Microsoft Search, Context IQ, Microsoft 365 apps. So as people search for content, they're not just going to get data and results from Microsoft 365, but they're also going to get data and results from other applications that have been data that's been ingested through the graph. And of course, data is protected by the same security and compliance policies. Now that the data is in Microsoft 365, it's going to be secured based on your compliance policies and security posture. Let's dive a little bit deeper into how the API calls are made. This is pretty popular in terms of walking through and understanding what the flow looks like for interacting with Copilot. So I want to walk through that a little bit here with you as well. User makes a prompt around summarizing the latest updates from the Fabricom project. That data goes to Copilot. Copilot goes ahead and sends that prompt and accesses the graph and semantic index for pre-processing. So it goes into your customer tenant and says, oh, based on all the data that's been collected, here's what I understand. Copilot will then send that modified prompt to the large language models, which are stored and surfaced up in Azure OpenAI. And this customer data is not going to be stored or used to train the language models. It's just there to reason. And the LLM will respond back, and that data that is then surfaced back to your semantic index for post-processing. And then once that's been done, then Copilot will go ahead and send that response and the app command back to the Microsoft 365 applications. The key here from a plugin perspective is your plugins actually are ingested or injected as part of when Copilot accesses the graph and semantic index for pre-processing. Your plugins are also get that request. Copilot will make that decision on there's a plugin being requested or what is that plugin category or catalog, and it'll retrieve and send those list of plugins back. And then as well as when Copilot sends that modified prompt to the large language model, it include some of that information from the plugins as well. And as you see at the bottom left there, your graph can be updated by both Dataverse as well as your Power Platform services.